Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What is your most disturbing, scary, or creepy true story? Story 1. Sinister Smile of the Dead.
In my culture, there is a belief that when someone dies violently, their clothes must be burned immediately. It is said that if their clothes are kept, they may bring misfortune, or the spirit of the deceased may return to seek revenge. My uncle, unfortunately, met his end in a way that no one could have imagined. He was dragged by a car and thrown into a ditch, a tragic and violent death that was fitting for the life he lived. When the coroner's office released his clothes, which were still stained with blood from the accident, his sister, who was my mother, and his wife were both curious and insisted on seeing them. But my uncle, in his last moments, had warned them not to look at the clothes. He had made it very clear that, if they did, there would be consequences. However, despite his warning, their curiosity got the best of them. I was a child at the time, only a bystander, but I followed them downstairs as they went to inspect the clothes. They told me to stay outside the room, which I did, but as I waited in the hallway, a strange sense of unease began to settle over me. Suddenly we heard a loud smash coming from upstairs. Startled, we rushed up to see what had happened. The glassware in the kitchen had shattered, but there was no one in the house. It was as if something or someone had violently tossed them across the room. My mother and aunt were shaken, but they didn't think much of it, probably trying to brush off the oddity. The house we were in was isolated, far from any neighbors, and it was the middle of winter. The snow outside covered everything, making the silence even more pronounced. That night, as the wake for my uncle continued, a family friend drove by the site of his accident. As she passed, she swore she saw my dead uncle standing by the roadside. He smiled at her, an unsettling, twisted smile that chilled her to the bone. The following morning, during the last day of the wake and just one day before the funeral, my uncle's ghostly presence was felt once more. My uncle, who had been staying at the wake with my mother and aunt, was visibly rattled. I overheard him tell my mother and aunt that he had heard the sound of boots crunching on snow outside at around 4 a.m. Panicked, he grabbed his shotgun and went outside to investigate. But when he looked around, there was no one there. The eeriness of the situation sent a wave of dread through the entire family. Finally, my aunt and mother confessed. They admitted to disobeying my uncle's warning and looking at his clothes. They had unwittingly triggered something sinister. My uncle, though gone, had clearly not let go of his anger. That was when my uncle's warning became clear to them. He had told them to burn the clothes, and they hadn't. Fearing what else might happen, they built a fire and burned the clothes in secrecy. The following day, my uncle was finally buried. After that, the house became eerily quiet. No one bothered them again. It was as if my uncle's spirit had found peace at last. But we all knew deep down that we had come dangerously close to something far darker.
Story 2. Apparition in the Hallway.
It started on Black Friday when my wife left me at home with our 2 sleeping kids, 1 and 3 years old. The youngest, my 1-year-old, slept in our room to avoid waking my other child. Around midnight, the baby woke up screaming. I rushed to his side, began rocking him, and tried to calm him down. As I was settling him back to sleep, I heard something strange: footsteps. The unmistakable sound of a toddler running across a wooden floor. I looked up, expecting to see my 3-year-old son. But instead, I saw a child-sized figure dash into the room. I was about to greet my son, but before I could speak, my brain processed something off. The figure wasn't him. It was an apparition of a child, one I couldn't explain. And as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into thin air. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just the hallway light playing tricks on me, but it felt too real. The chill that washed over me was undeniable. My mind was reeling from what I had just witnessed. Since then, odd things have been happening. One night, I was standing by a door when a bottle of shoe polish fell on my head. The bizarre thing, the bottle had been sitting on a counter behind the door, and I was on the opposite side of it when it somehow dropped on me. I tried to write it off as nothing, but it added to the mounting sense of unease. Even stranger things started happening, like random toys going off at night. I know they could be explained away by simple malfunctions, but it still unsettled me. The most chilling event occurred a few weeks ago. I went upstairs to use the bathroom, while my wife stayed downstairs in the living room. As I was in the bathroom, I heard a man's voice talking just outside the door. I assumed it was the TV. When I came out, my wife asked if I had been talking to her, and I said no. The TV was off. Both of us distinctly heard a man's voice talking in the hallway, clear as day. We looked at each other, fear creeping into our minds. No explanation, just the unsettling certainty that something was there.
Story 3. Something was watching.
There was a house next door to us that had 3 separate renters, each of whom had no knowledge of the others and had never met. However, my mother knew all of them, as she worked with one of them. They all told her eerily similar stories, and each account was chilling in its own right. The renters all described a strange sensation. They never felt alone in the house. It was that feeling you get when you're in a house, and you know someone is there, even if you don't see or hear them. One of them even described how she'd feel something brushing against her leg, light pressure, or sometimes even something tugging at her pants or dress. In one instance, she yelled at what she thought was a small child grabbing her, as it was at the height of a child's hand. One of the tenants had a particularly unsettling experience. She recalled falling asleep in a chair, caught between waking and dreaming. In her half-dream state, she felt pressure on her leg, as if something was climbing onto her lap. Then, it moved up to her chest. The strange sensation became even more disturbing when she felt as though something was trying to enter her mouth. In a state of full awakening, she bolted upright, terrified, and immediately left the house. What made the story even more chilling for me was that, as kids, my friends and I would dare each other to approach that very house when it was abandoned. Something about that house terrified us. We could barely step onto the porch or look through the windows. It wasn't like other houses. There was an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to hang over it. We were too scared to even get close to the place. All 3 of the renters eventually moved out, unable to shake the unnerving presence that had plagued them. To this day, I can't help but wonder what haunted that house, or what waited for anyone who dared to stay there.
Story 4. Highway of Lost Souls.
When I was just 4 years old, A tragic accident occurred that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My father, stepmother, and baby brother were all killed in a devastating highway collision with a semi-truck. They had pulled over on the side of Highway 84 in West Texas, between Lubbock and Abilene, to check on my baby brother, who was having a fit in the car. The semi-truck driver, who had been driving for far too many hours, veered onto the shoulder of the highway. At 70 miles per hour, the truck struck their stationary vehicle with an unimaginable force, causing a horrific collision that resulted in a fire. Tragically, none of my family members survived the crash. The only person to walk away from that wreckage was the truck driver. At the time, I was just 4, and I had been distanced from my father since my parents had split. Because of that, I don't have any memory of him or my family. I didn't even know the extent of what had happened until much later in life. What happened after was even stranger. As fate would have it, I ended up attending Texas Tech University in Lubbock, and I would drive past that very spot on my way back and forth to Dallas-Fort Worth. The area where my family's lives had ended seemed to follow me in some twisted way. I never thought much of it until one day I decided to look up the incident. I found an article that described a witness who had seen the crash and called for help. But the eerie part was that the witness had lived in a house near the highway and described seeing something strange. They said they had seen my family, my father, stepmother, and baby brother, walking along the side of the highway after the accident. The witness reported that the family seemed to continue their journey walking, but never getting any closer to their destination. They described seeing them over and over, stuck in some endless loop, trapped in a realm between life and death. This deeply disturbed me, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I realized that my family had been coming from Albuquerque on their way to pick me up in Houston. They were only a few hours away from seeing me again when their lives were tragically cut short. I didn't know the person who wrote the article, yet their words struck a chord within me. The connection felt so real and personal, as if I had stumbled upon a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. I broke down in tears, overcome by a grief I didn't know I could still feel after all these years. Determined to learn more, I drove out to that spot. With the help of some local residents who remembered the incident from the late 90s, I managed to find the exact location. I stood there for a long while, silent, in respect, and perhaps seeking some form of closure. But as I stood there, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the spirits of my family, lost in time, were still wandering that highway, forever trapped in the place where their lives were stolen from them. This experience has stayed with me, and it's one of the strangest, most terrifying stories I have. A family lost in the afterlife, unable to reach their final destination. It's a haunting that lingers, one that I will never forget.
Story 5. Whispers from the Trenches.
Years ago, I stayed for a few nights at a hotel in the New Forest, a national park on the south coast of England. The hotel was an imposing former hunting lodge, built in the 19th century, with a grand yet eerie atmosphere. From the moment I entered my room, a sense of unease settled over me. It felt as though there were others in the room with me, watching me, though I was alone. I'm not the type to give in to such feelings, but this time it was overwhelming. I was part of a larger group, and after the first night, I spoke to others. They too shared that uncomfortable feeling, as though something was wrong, though none could explain it. That first night, sleep eluded me. It took me longer than usual to settle in, and for the first time in my adult life, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. When I finally drifted into sleep, my dreams were not dreams at all. I found myself in a trench somewhere during the Great War. The air was thick with smoke, and I could hear the constant, terrifying bangs of explosions and the sharp crack of artillery pieces firing. The nightmare was vivid and felt all too real. I awoke in a cold sweat, my heart racing, my body stiff with fear. I could hear a faint banging sound, perhaps the wind moving metal roofing. But it only made the situation worse. The feeling that I was not alone, that others were near, intensified. The oppressive atmosphere in the room pressed on me like a heavy weight. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, and I spent the rest of the night in a kind of daze, unable to sleep. The next morning, as I went downstairs for breakfast, I noticed a frame on the wall containing old photographs and a story about the hotel's history. The hotel had once been converted into a military hospital during World War I. I had no prior knowledge of this when I arrived, nor had I read anything about the war recently. I couldn't explain it, but suddenly everything about that night made sense. I had unknowingly tapped into something from the past, a presence that still lingered in the building, echoing the horrors of the war. I spent the rest of my stay with a friend in a different room. The feeling of dread didn't lift. My friend too felt the unease, and we both left the hotel feeling as though some sinister still lingered there, waiting.
Story 6. Shadow with Yellow Eyes.
As a child, I used to have terrible nightmares every night, along with the occasional night terrors. It got so bad that I never slept more than 4 hours a night. I believe it was a combination of sleep deprivation and general paranoia that made me start seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Usually when I looked back, there was nothing there. However, one night, while walking through a hallway in my house, I turned around and there actually was something there. It was tall, looking like a smoky, wispy silhouette, except for the yellow eyes, which appeared very solid and bright in the dim light. I've never felt such dread in my life as I did in that moment. I used to be religious, and I didn't find this out until years later. But my church had actually told my father that something with yellow eyes was tormenting me. It made my skin crawl when he told me, because I had never mentioned it to him before. At some point, it stopped, and I grew up and mostly forgot about it. A few months ago, I took my preteen sister to see a midnight showing of a horror film. Afterward, we began talking about our weird and creepy experiences and tried to rationalize them. Most of our experiences had logical explanations, until she told me that when she was younger, she used to see shadow people out of the corner of her eyes. I laughed and said it was funny because I had seen them too. It stopped being funny when she told me about one particular day. She had been home alone, sick from school, watching television during broad daylight, when she suddenly heard something down the hallway. She turned around and saw a wispy, tall silhouette with bright yellow eyes. I had a difficult time sleeping that night.
Story 7. Crawling Creatures.
When I was 7, my parents sent me to live with my grandmother for a few months while they worked in another city. My big brother was finishing middle school, and it was supposed to be a temporary arrangement. I was excited because I knew my grandma would spoil me, and I looked forward to the change. She lived in a small 2-bedroom house with 4 of my aunts and my uncle. It was a bit crowded, so 3 of my aunts and I shared one bedroom, while my uncle and grandma slept in the living room. One of my aunts had her own room. The reason? She was schizophrenic. My aunt had been unwell for years. I remember her talking to herself for hours and drawing strange pictures on the walls with crayons. It seemed normal at the time, but now that I look back, I realize how unsettling it really was. I thought it was funny at first, living in a house where I felt like I was the only sane one around. But that feeling quickly changed. One night, I woke up to find my aunt standing over me, holding a pair of scissors, the blades dangerously close to my neck. I was paralyzed with fear. The most likely explanation was that she had developed a habit of cutting hair, and maybe she just wanted to snip one of my strands. But we never really knew for sure. Whatever her intent, it didn't matter. My parents came and picked me up immediately, moving me to a new house. This new place was old and eerie, and the terror only deepened. At night, earthworms would crawl up from the drains in the toilet and shower, writhing and squirming in the dark. As a child, I thought I had entered a waking nightmare. Between the haunting presence of my aunt and the grotesque creatures in the house, I truly believed I was living in some twisted horror story.
Story 8. Caretakers Nightmare.
I was home alone with my grandmother. I was her caretaker. She had suffered a serious stroke a few months earlier that left her paralyzed on one side and unable to communicate verbally. It was Easter, and my mother and aunt had hosted a dinner before both of them went out, leaving behind a huge mess. It was around midnight by then, and I was exhausted but just starting to clean after putting my grandmother to bed. Over the past week or so, she had been doing something new. Sometimes when we put her to bed, she would start screaming just a few minutes after the light was turned off. When I'd go in, she'd be sobbing and pulling on her hair in fear. Since she couldn't talk, I would ask her lots of yes and no questions, but I was at a loss for how to guide the conversation. All she had indicated so far was that, through pointing, something in the back upper corner of her room was scaring her. She also reached for a photograph, indicating it had something to do with her deceased parents. Through kissing a crucifix, she showed how terrified it made her, and she had never been religious. And through an unsettling imitation, she showed that whatever it was had a very big open mouth. But tonight, she was quiet. So I began tidying up the living room. As I was straightening a stack of towels meant for the kitchen, I heard voices. Men's voices so clear that I instantly assumed I had somehow turned on the television in a dead-bolted room on the far side of the kitchen. I picked up the remote and pressed power. Nothing. I walked a few steps closer, and the bathroom, built off the kitchen in this old house, was now to my left. I had that prickling sensation I used to get as a kid. But I ignored it as the voices slowly faded into the sound of water running in the pipe. Well, okay, I told myself, I'm just overtired. I turned back to the towels, and when I came back, I saw something. Papers were on the floor, papers that had just been on the table moments before. I told myself I was just tired. I picked them up and returned to the kitchen to grab some dishes. And as I passed the bathroom, I saw a small man in a hat dancing in there. By now, I was starting to get irritated, but the dishes still needed doing, so I shut the bathroom door and brought the dishes into the kitchen. That's when I saw it, the TV cable lying on the kitchen floor from the dead-bolted room. I placed it on the table and began scrubbing the dishes. Nope, I thought, I'm just tired. No ghosts, demons, or anything else here. I hummed to show how in control and unconcerned I was. As I scrubbed a final casserole dish, I suddenly heard 3 quick, loud knocks on the bottom of the sink, like something was crouched in the cabinet underneath and tapping on it with its knuckles. I picked up the dish and dropped it experimentally to see if I had caused an echo. I had just dropped it a moment ago. Pause, silence. I went back to scrubbing, a little more subdued this time. Then the cabinet door swung out deliberately and hit my knee twice with a small pause in between. Nope, I thought. Not dealing with this. I dropped the dish, left the kitchen, and went into the living room. I repeated the Lord's Prayer until that prickling feeling left me. My grandmother's room was on the far side of the living room, and I did not want that thing anywhere near her. She never screamed at night again after that.
Story 9. Unsettling Laughter.
When I was 10 years old, my sister and I lived in a house in Thailand that was haunted. We shared a room, and there was a Jack and Jill bathroom that separated an empty room. At that time, maids were affordable, so we had one. She would always yell at us for leaving the ceiling fan on, but we never went into that room. The room was upstairs, and whenever we were downstairs, we would hear the sound of children running, bouncing balls, and laughing coming from that room. One night, we invited a friend over for a sleepover. We decided to make blanket forts in the empty room, but there was an old armoire in the corner. We turned off the lights, and the 3 of us began chatting when we suddenly heard scratches on the wall. We froze in place, terrified. The scratches grew louder. Then the armoire doors creaked open by themselves. Without a second thought, we bolted out of the room as fast as we could. It was the scariest experience I had ever been through. Later, we learned something that chilled us even more. Behind our backyard fence, there was a swamp. Local people told us that many babies had been dumped there over the years. We realized that the sounds we were hearing might not have just been a coincidence, but rather the echoes of restless spirits. The house felt different after that night. It was as if something sinister had been awakened. We could never shake the feeling that the spirits of those lost children were still there, roaming the halls and trying to make contact. We never went near that room again, and the noises stopped. But the memory still haunts me to this day.
Story 10. Blue Lady.
When I was between 8 and 10 years old, my family moved into one of 2 houses on a property. The owner, who lived about 8 hours away, asked us to keep an eye on the place. It was the early 1980s, and what we would soon experience would haunt us for years. From the moment we arrived, something was wrong. We immediately began to see an apparition standing on the back porch of the other house. The figure was a blue shape, resembling a woman wearing a large dress, holding an open umbrella. There were no visible features, just a silhouette. The figure didn't appear during the day, but at various times every day it would manifest. And it wasn't just us who saw it. Every visitor to our house would see the apparition too. In fact, some of my dad's friends would come over, and they'd all stand outside in our yard, staring at it in eerie silence. We lived there for 2 years, and the experiences we had could fill pages. We were given a key to the other house, and my mum would often go over to use the phone in the kitchen. She would always demand I accompany her, fearful of what might happen if she went alone. The key was to the back door, which led directly into the kitchen. But if the apparition was visible, my mum would never get through with her call. Walking into the house felt as though we were walking through water up to our necks. The air was thick, oppressive, and heavy. I remember one time my mum was sitting at the kitchen table, talking on the phone. I was terrified, watching a dish drainer filled with silverware and plates. Suddenly it began rattling, as if someone was shaking it. Both of us ran out in a panic. On another occasion, as we stood in the kitchen, a door deeper inside the house began slamming shut repeatedly. It was as if something was violently forcing it to open and close, bam, 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 until we bolted out of there. In one bedroom, an old dresser with metal loops on its drawers began to shake violently. The noise was so loud we could hear it in the kitchen. Another time I tried to grab a glass of water from the counter. As I reached for it, the glass slid away from my hand, moving down the length of the counter before crashing into the sink. But nothing was more terrifying than the day I needed to use the restroom. As I walked down the hallway toward the bathroom, I heard voices, 2 men and a woman talking. The closer I got to the bathroom, the louder their conversation grew. When I opened the door and turned on the light, I saw something I'll never forget. Standing in the bathtub was a woman dressed in a large 1920s style dress, holding an open umbrella. On either side of her stood 2 men, dressed in striped overalls and matching caps. The moment they saw me, their faces twisted with anger. I screamed, ran back down the hall, and my mum chased after me, unsure of why I was running. One winter, my parents brought a heavy blanket from the other house. That night, things began to happen in our house. The television would randomly turn on, sometimes in the middle of the night, accompanied by the sound of a popping noise. One evening, while my parents were watching television, the toilet flushed on its own. Another time, I witnessed my dad reaching for a book my mom had left on the bed. As he neared it, the book leapt off the bed and slid across the room, as if something invisible was pushing it away. This happened twice, until my dad had to physically hold the book down to grab it. The strange happenings continued for 2 years, but one day my dad found an old photo album. As we flipped through it, I froze when I saw a picture of the exact 3 people I had seen in the bathroom. The photo was taken in the early 1900s, and the woman in the picture was married to one of the men who stood next to her, while the other man was a friend of her husband's. This was the family that once owned the house. Soon after, we moved out. My dad had enough of the strange occurrences, the blankets being pulled off in the middle of the night, doors slamming, lights flickering, and apparitions standing beside the bed. Years later, I returned to the area after being away for 20 years. I drove by the house, expecting it to be abandoned or in ruins. To my surprise, people were living there. I struck up a conversation with a woman who lived there and discovered that, over the years, she and her daughter had experienced strange happenings. Pictures mysteriously removed from walls, doors slamming, and more. They had no explanation for these events. This was the same house where my family had lived, haunted by the Blue Lady and the spirits of a bygone era.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.